Hello and welcome to the Superversive quote live stream unquote. Uh we are not live today. This is due to technology issues. But I insisted, come hell or high water, that we would be doing a stream today. And so we are. We're just gonna record it and then post it for all of you in advance. So no live chat today. Sorry, folks. We are on our own. It is me, Anthony Marquetta. Ben is unfortunately unavailable, but we have, never fear, a new guest, David Hallquist,
How do
who
you
is
do?
David is a fellow Pinkerton's Ghost author. He's not one of the big three main authors with me, Ben, and Ken, but he has done the Blood Money trilogy and has more coming. He also has written several series. If you want to talk about them, David, and plug yourself a bit.
Sure thing. I have two series that are currently out, which are the Warrior series from CKP, Chris Kennedy Publishing, and also the War Angel series, Giant Bots in Space, proving that the perfect novel does exist. Both available from Chris Kennedy Publishing, and I've done a number of small stories and anthologies.
That is fantastic. So today we have a very specific topic, more specific, I think, than we normally have on the live streams. We are going to be discussing how we plot our novels. So this is specifically about novel-length stories, not short stories. In terms of short stories, plotting can vary wildly depending on the story. I have written stories in almost one go with no outline at all, and I have written stories with extensive detailed outlines that were roughly the same length, between 2,000 and 4,000 words. So it's very different when you're talking about short stories versus a novel. So there's the eternal debate that they call plotting versus pantsing. Number one, I hate the term pantsing. I think it sounds kind of infantile and unprofessional, but it is what it is. It generally means writing without an outline. So I'm going to give my opinion on the practice first. Now, keep in mind that I have not finished a full-length novel. I have finished one full-length work. It was a 100-page script. It was terrible. I hate it. And luckily for me, it is lost. It is a piece of lost media. When I die and I'm famous and people are looking for the collected works of Anthony Marquetta, that's going to be the Holy Grail. But mercifully, at the moment, it is gone forever. So I have not finished a novel, however. I am in the middle of a novel with El Jaji Lamplighter's novel writing class. We talked about it a couple times already. It is an adaptation of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Right now, I am leaning towards the working title, The Song of Orpheus. So I guess that's what I'll refer to it as. The novel I'm working on, it's an adaptation of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth called The Song of Orpheus. I am very confident I am going to get this novel done, and I am very confident that come hell or high water, it is going to be published, even if I need to self-publish it. I'm fingers crossed. There may be a way for me to actually get a publisher, but there are no guarantees from anyone as of now. One way or another, though, that novel will see the light of day. So, full disclosure, then, that's my whole thing. Like, I haven't actually written a full-length novel. I'm in the middle of one. I would say about a third of the way through right now, maybe. And that's a rough estimate. Maybe a little less, more like a quarter. So, in terms of my own process and what I think of it, I am not a believer in pantsing a novel. That means plotting from the seat of your pants, meaning you don't write an outline. I don't believe in this. I think it is a mistake. I don't think it works. It will make you, best case scenario, take more time writing your novel if you pants it. You will lose time because constantly when you get to a new plot point, you are going to be forced to sit and think until you know what comes next. And there's going to be much looser cause and effect. And that doesn't mean you'll necessarily have a bad novel, but it does mean you're going to need to do extensive editing later. So I am a big believer in outlining your novel in advance. Now, how detailed the outline is another thing. I'm not saying that you necessarily need to have a fully detailed outline, but you need something. What do you think, David?
I think structure is important. Uh, it depends on the scope of the work, how much detail you go into, and it depends on how comfortable you are kind of stepping out into the void. There are a handful of people who are really good pantsers and write that well. They are a handful of people. Odds are you are not one of them. And I've never heard of anyone who is a pantser who said, oh no, an outline made my stuff worse. Because remember, your outline is a framework. It is an idea that you can use, but it's not something that you have to. You may deviate, you may add things, you may subtract things. But with an outline, you have an overarching structure to what you're going to do. You know how it's going to begin, you know what the challenges are going to be, you know what the end is, you know who the main characters are. And you don't have to be rattling your brain through it when you get to that tough part 1/3 or 1/4 of the way through and you go, now what? Because you've already worked it out. Typically, when you're looking at the outline structure in terms of how much detail, some people go all the way to writing very complex outlines where they have a paragraph of information with each chapter logically laid out. Some people just will do a couple of lines. You know, this is the overall structure. These are the chapters. This is what's going on. Here's the beginning. Here's the end. Here's a list of characters. I do something in between. I go from top down. So I work out who the main character is, what they're facing, and the beginning and the end. Then I fill in all of the challenges and all of the arcs that are going on in between those, fill in the supplementary characters, and then I'll add a few details in each of those lines. It's a wonderful thing about a word processor. You don't have to worry about if you have enough space between everything. And by the time you're done, you usually got, you can make a good novel out of 1 to 2 pages of outline. It doesn't need to be beautiful, but you do want it to be crisp. You want to be able to glance at it and immediately know what's going on so you don't get lost in your story.
All right, that's some really that's good insight, and I would tend to agree with your analysis of it. So, in terms of the methods of outlining, there are a lot of different schools of thought. Now, I know some people just balk at the idea of doing a super detailed outline, and I totally understand why you would. I used to, and then I found that I was just losing time the less detailed my outlines were. So I looked for ways to do it, and I have found a lot of success using the Snowflake outline method because I found it to be very flexible. So here's the thing, I'm not a fan of plotting to beats, if that makes sense. Like the 3-act plot structure, the 5-act plot structure, the hero's journey, where you need to hit beats in a story. I'm not saying you can't do that. People do. It absolutely works. Or like the save the cat structure that's used in screenwriting is another one. But it definitely works. And if you're a beginner too, it's not a bad idea to keep to that. However, I don't necessarily love doing that because it does make things feel very samey. This is especially true in Hollywood with things like the Save the Cat structure. Uh, I would prefer to make the story a little bit more organic. With that said, that might be better for people who are a little bit more experienced. Now, I will say that at this point in time, I consider myself, even though I haven't finished a full-length novel, I have written the equivalent of multiple novels in terms of like my output. So I consider myself an experienced writer. Pinkerton's Ghosts alone has been at least my stories on their own have at least been the length of one short-ish full-length novel. Then you combine that with my previous works and things like that. Like I'm an experienced writer at this point. So I don't feel the need necessarily to wed myself to those plot structures, though I could totally understand why you would. They work for a reason. However, like the problem that I have with wedding myself very tightly to those sorts of plot structures, especially if you're outlining your work in advance, is there's, for example, a Japanese story structure that's very popular. Miyazaki uses it in his films to brilliant effect, and he follows it almost beat for beat. It's called the Kishouden Ketsu, and it is a conflictless story structure. Literally, it is a way of crafting a story without necessarily having a conflict. The Kishouden Ketsu allows for a conflict, but it does not need a conflict.
I may probably burn some bridges here, but while I haven't seen all of Miyazaki, I would say conflict can exist. It just isn't necessarily, you have to be violence or win lose. You have conflict when you have what the protagonist wants, something is in the way of that, and then the conflict is which leads to the resolution or irresolution. So
So here's the thing. You're absolutely right. And in the Western storytelling tradition, stories need conflicts, right? They need conflicts in Western storytelling. Eastern storytelling, however, and the Kishouden Ketsu structure, not necessarily. So take My Neighbor Totoro, which follows the Kishouden Ketsu perfectly. Like, perfectly. It is beat for beat, the Kishouden Ketsu. Kishouden Ketsu is broken up into 4 parts: the Ki, the Shao, the Ten, and the Ketsu. So the Ki is the introduction. You're introduced to the characters and the world, and generally things going on. We have a new surprise guest. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the authoress A.M. Freeman.
hooray.
April, we are not live. This is going to be recorded and put up later.
Okay, fun.
We are discussing plotting out our stories. I am talking about the Kishouden Ketsu plot structure and why I don't like necessarily outlining and plotting to the traditional story structures, because I think that there's more variety there than necessarily is allowed by things like the hero's journey. So I'm talking about the Kishouden Ketsu and how My Neighbor Totoro fits it. After I'm done, you could give your perspective on plotting.
Okay, interesting. I've never seen My Neighbor Totoro yet, so
I
guess
My
there'll
dog
be
is barking
spoilers.
in the background. Hold on a second.
April, you have to see it.
I know it's one. I've seen most of them of the Studio Ghibli movies, but haven't seen that one. I still know very little about it. So like,
Which film is this? I'm sorry, Totoro.
Totoro.
Yeah, I haven't seen Totoro, and I haven't run into any spoilers yet.
Totoro is the.
I'm sorry because I'm about to spoil the entire thing.
I'll just hop back on in a minute. Just like
Have you
message
watched,
me when you're done, and I'll come back on.
Well, hold on a moment. Have you watched Kiki's?
I think like forever ago, but I don't remember it.
Would you mind if I talked about it, or would you prefer to just hop off?
I'll probably just hop off and let me know when you're done talking about those.
Okay,
and then I'll
it won't be that
on.
long, honestly. I'm just trying to make a point.
Okay, I'll be back in a little while. See you guys.
Okay.
A.M. Freeman, ladies and gentlemen. She will be back. So to go into my point about Totoro. So Totoro starts off with the introduction, and then you have the Shao, the expanding of the world and the characters. You see more about what the girl's life is like after you're introduced to them and the things going on. You learn their mother is in the hospital. You learn about Totoro. The 10 is the twist. This is something sudden happens that's seemingly unrelated to the rest of the story. In this case, we learn that the mother is not going to be coming home and Mei goes missing.
Right.
And then the Ketsu. That's when the Ki Shao and the 10 are connected together. Totoro, who we were introduced in the Shao section of the story, helps Satsuki find Mei, and then they go and find their mother and learn that she's really fine. She's just going to be delayed a little bit, and there's nothing, nothing seriously wrong. So that's the Kishouden Ketsu. Now, you could argue in My Neighbor Totoro's case that there is sort of a conflict, but I think you would be stretching the definition at that point. Like, the idea of there being a conflict in My Neighbor Totoro really does not come up until the very, very, very end. For the vast majority of it, the girls are just living their lives, and yet there is a very clear structure to My Neighbor Totoro. And
very much so. There's the period where she is coming to a new house and there's kind of the worry and learning to meet everybody. There's the obstacle of, exploring the world and this semi-magical area where, looking from a children's perspective, how can you tell the difference between magic and reality and what's really going on? And of course, she's like 3 or 4, so she's not weighing this stuff. She's just experiencing everything in a hybrid of insight, imagination, and sensory impression. And then, of course, you have the concern of what's happening with the mother, where she tries to go out and be the hero, and turns out she didn't actually need to do that. So I think you can say there's still obstacles. Like, you can even have sort of conflicts with a romance. I think the
So the
structure of,
Kishouden Ketsu, yeah, it doesn't preclude conflict. It just doesn't require conflict is the key. None of the steps that I've indicated in the Kishouden Ketsu necessitate there being a conflict. There could be no problems for the characters to solve. You know, you could easily have a Kishouden Ketsu where the 10, instead of it being them trying to help their mother or them trying to find Mei,
Mhm.
it could simply be, you know, they decide to have fun in the woods and there's nothing wrong, and then they meet Totoro or something, and then that connects it again. Now, that wouldn't be as satisfying in this particular case, but it would work. And there are a lot of Japanese films that follow the Kishouden Ketsu. Your Name is another one. Like, I don't know if people notice, maybe not, but if you really pay attention to Your Name and you actually map the plot beats out, it's a Kishouden Ketsu. It's, in fact, a very closely followed Kishouden Ketsu. You introduce the characters and what's going on. In fact, it opens up with them already body swapped in Your Name. If you don't know the movie, it's a body swapping film. And then you introduce more about the characters and their world. The 10 is this very sudden emergence of like, oh my god, you know, there's going to be a meteor that hits the town. And then the Tetsu, which is that the body swapping is what enables them to save the town and save everyone's lives and, you know, all of that stuff, right? So Your Name is another example that people don't even realize is a Kishouden Ketsu that is. My point being that I think that plotting to a plot outline is not necessarily the best. Plotting beat for beat. It might be good for beginners, and one day I might even want to try writing a Kishouden Ketsu story just for the fun of it.
Okay.
But I don't necessarily think that doing that, I think you're limiting yourself unnecessarily. I think your story needs to be what it is.
Well,
So
and you also don't need to do the hero's journey. It's not by any means the only Western approach on it. A lot of outlining that I'll do has kind of a fractal structure to it. And when you look at series, you'll have different levels, different beats, so to speak, of conflict resolution, then kind of like a rest phase in between. And I think you want to kind of form a wave-like pattern with something like this. You're giving people a chance to recover, either if it's from the action scene, if it's a horror, you certainly need people to recover from that. And even with the tension that's involved in something like a romance or something, you want something there. If your thing is simply an expose into the fantastic, you want bits of normality to like contrast with it. And then you still have a series of rising beats until the end. So I still think you want some kind of structure. And Totoro also has kind of a rising structure of that. In that case, it's the amount of weirdness that's going on. It starts with just these few little dust balls that appear to be animate, semi-magical. You know, are they dangerous? Are they friendly? Who can tell? All the way up to the bizarro land weirdness with the cat bus and everything. So, and I think that's a natural consequence of just how we process information as human beings. Because if they'd started with all the crazy stuff at first, the more minor elements that kind of draw your attention in wouldn't have been as impactful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think what I'm getting at is that when you're talking about outlining a story, and you're talking about, you know, coming up with a structure for your story, I would say that it is more important to keep true to, in your outline, like what you believe your story needs to be, right? To have a vision for it. So I'm a fan of, and where I've been going with this, though, in a very roundabout way, I'm a fan of the Snowflake outline method. Are you familiar with that by any chance?
Fill me in. I may have used it without even knowing the name.
It's possible. So I found this one day, like years ago, and I decided to try it. And I tried it with my Orpheus novel, and I found it incredibly helpful. So you start out by writing a single sentence summarizing your story. The sentence should be no more than 15 words. It should be the barest possible summary, and you should work on not making it long. Like, it should not be detailed. That's the whole point. 15 words or less, one sentence, summary of your story. So in my case, the summary would be something like, and I actually have all of this written down because I genuinely sat down and did a Snowflake outline, but I don't have it in front of me, so this isn't exactly it. Orpheus is a slave of King Theseus, where he falls in love with a woman and has to rescue her from the underworld, something like that.
Okay.
Right. And then something happens. Whether I don't have my exact sentence in front of me, plus I don't want to give away my own ending, so
Sure.
I'm going to be slightly coy about it. But you take that one sentence, and then the snowflake is like a fractal pattern, something like you said. Actually, you expand it into a paragraph. So the paragraph should be no more than like 5 sentences or so, somewhere around that. You expand everything slightly. Now you take that paragraph and you expand the paragraph into a 5-paragraph summary, one for each sentence, where you expand it out more. Then you take any characters that you've mentioned in there and you start with a quick 1-page thing on the characters, goals, motivations, things like that. All of that stuff about the characters. And you slowly expand and you talk about more and more about the characters. Like, here's their goal, here's their motivation, here is their personality, and then you write a paragraph on the character. Then you write a full page on the character, and you do this for all of the major characters in the story. Then you take that outline, now that you've written about your characters, and you turn each paragraph into a page. And you could keep getting more and more detailed. Like, the snowflake outline eventually goes into, you could go scene by scene if you want to, and I know people who do. Like, I've seen authors say, like, yeah, I write like scene by scene descriptions of what I'm going to write. I didn't go that detailed. I did a multi-page outline with full pages for each of my main characters, and
Okay.
when I did that, I found it way easier to write my story.
That sounds awesome, man. It sounds very disciplined. And it sounds like you can use the amount of detail you want or not want on it. I do a much more simple kind of outline structure. The first thing I do after I have kind of that sort of almost like the one sentence, I don't restrict myself to one sentence, but I create a kind of a brief description of what I got. And then I make sure I have the ending in mind before I write the beginning. Then I work out the beginning, and then in between are these beats or waves. I write actions, so mine are action sequences. But if you were doing romance or you were doing horror, they would be peaks of those moments where you have where the tension basically becomes maximum. But where you have each case you have the character, they're trying to accomplish something. There's something in the way. And, character wants X, but for C, accomplishes it with D, or doesn't accomplish it. Then there's a period in between, and that leads to the next one. I usually find that the big waves end up being parts, and you can do 3 to 5 parts in your book. And then subbed into there in the chapters where I was saying it's kind of fractal is you have sub-issues that are again involved in each one. So I try and set it so you have a series of rising waves that crest at the end of part 1. Then it kind of comes back. Then a higher set of rising waves that crest higher at part 2. And you get the picture up until your final conclusion where you aim to break it out to 11. The thing I've found also that I spend a lot of time on is the opening. I think you want your first sentence, and should really tailor it carefully, should make it impossible to put the thing, hello again.
I'm back.
I'm just finishing up. I think the first sentence you write should be such that they have to read the first paragraph. The first paragraph should so capture someone's attention, they have to read that first page. The first page should draw someone into reading the rest of your introduction or your first chapter. And at that point, they should be hooked for the book. Because you are competing for eyeballs. Okay. April, how do you think outlining should be? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say exactly what you just said. April, what is your perspective on this? Like, first off, you have finished a novel. It was a children's novel, but you finished it. Mary May and the Nightmare Man, which was excellent. Really loved it.
She really liked it.
And I know that you're in the same novel writing class that I am in, and I have been reading your attempt to outline your current story. So I won't give any details about it because it's your story and it's not public yet. But I could say that you have a lot of really interesting ideas. So, like, what is your perspective on that one? How did you get your story done?
Let's see. So piggybacking off of David real quick, definitely, like,
hang on a minute.
Wait, your husband's talking. Hang on a second.
Wait, are you talking to me or are you
I'm talking on the stream.
Oh,
You're doing your thing, I'm doing my thing.
Simultaneous on the Superversive stream right now, and I thought we were trying to talk to
Wait, I thought you were on your gaming stream.
I am in my gaming stream.
Yeah, then I'm on the Superversive. Okay, I thought we were Okay, anyway, so.
Hi, Mr. April's husband. Do I know you don't
Yeah,
like
he's-
everything we talked about last night.
We're both on
I
a
just
thing right now. He's doing his
that
game on this
you and I
thing.
have very
But
different
yes, you need,
interpretations of
like, there's,
certain interactions and
you-
relationships.
you want to introduce
So I'm like,
questions,
shoot,
and
I-
as you answer
I'm
those
like,
questions,
I
you
can't
want to
see it,
introduce more
sorry.
questions. The first, Josh is really good at, in her different, like, writing classes and talking to her, system of,
And
like,
then I was
getting that
reminded
hook
how big
and the
inflation's
different, like,
getting, because
the
there's
first,
a little,
paragraph or so,
phrase,
you want to
kinda
establish,
Steak and
like,
Shake
the
right next to
character,
theater.
the setting, and
So we
some
went
of the
there for
conflict.
burgers and shake
Within
afterwards.
that first,
and it was
you could
fun.
maybe
It's like
focus on
the
one
teenagers
thing in the
50s.
opening paragraph, like
This is fun.
the problem,
And I
or
get the bill for
a
2
really
hamburgers
interesting
and 2
description
shakes,
of,
and I'm
like, the place of, like,
teenagers are absolutely
it was the
screwed.
11th hour or something like that, or not the 13th hour. I don't know. You could do something where it's like, what's that mean, and lead into it, or like, I suppose and then I was plummeting to my death, whatever thing that catches the attention, and then maybe answers that question in the first paragraph, but then introduces a different question, and then that's answered within that first page,
No,
but then
yeah,
it's
it was-
introducing other questions, kind of
It was
slowly
it was
building
like
up,
$30
but,
for
I've
hamburgers, fries, and a shake.
I've read a part of a book that it's got to like the 7th chapter, and I had no idea what conflict was, and it was a big problem. So, you definitely need. I like David's way of describing it, of like the first line brings you into the first paragraph, which brings you to the first page, which gets you through the first chapter,
I've
which then
seen
gets
my
you hooked
gas
on
in
the
the
story.
story jump like 20 cents a gallon.
Down with that. Let's see.
No rhyme or reason to it.
As far as plotting, I feel like I got a lot of practice plotting when I was doing the planetary stories, because all those had to be kind of, all right, fit in this theme or this planet,
Anyway,
and this kind of general timeline thing I had going
going
on. And then, all right, so I've got that I need to fit it in. Now I need to get some ideas and figure out how to make those ideas into a story. So it was, it's been kind of a couple years since I was doing all that. But for me, that gave me a lot of practice of like, all right, how do you take an idea, hook at that idea? How do you bring in other ideas like Jaji's, explanation of the strings? You need different strings, different conflicts to help build a story, like at least 2 in every scene that helps drive the story. And with so what I'm working on right now, I have it titled as like my tree book. And I've had this sort of idea and concept in my head for, years. I was like a teen when I kind of came up with it. But I had like the hardest time plotting that one of anything I've tried to plot. Like, feels like moving through molasses of trying to find the conflicts and the the things that will drive the story and drive the conflicts, and it's still going to take a lot more world building. I think I finally have like a general sense of the story, and I need to do more in-depth world building to keep getting the pieces together. I think when you're plotting and world building, like you got to kind of sometimes jump to different points of like, okay, now I need to develop my characters a little bit more to kind of figure out what's going to happen. Or now I need to go and like kind of figure out the setting a bit more, and then that ping pongs into like maybe I need to dig more into what I want my theme to be. I guess a lot of times it's just kind of asking questions and researching things to try and like, especially if it's like a sci-fi or a fantasy kind of thing, you kind of get some ideas, and you're like, oh, what would happen if X, Y, and Z? And so you go researching that topic to help kind of flesh that out or spark new ideas, especially if it's more like speculative or sci-fi. Let's see. I should probably Am I on track with the questions? Just kind of rambling.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's more or less what I'm looking for. Because I think one thing that I was thinking of is that I think there's a little bit of a misnomer sometimes in terms of writing, where you talk about plot-based versus character-based novels. Now, on one hand, there is some truth to this. Like, if you read an Agatha Christie, for example, especially like Agatha Christie's masterpiece, it's generally considered to be the book And Then There Were None. Original title, 10 Little Indians, but And Then There Were None is a better title, so I'm going to use that. So, in And Then There Were None, the characters are like almost dolls, if that makes sense. They are set up with very basic traits.
Oh, nice. Did you guys take care of this
and
last game, or
is like
is this what
a
we've fallen in on? From
April,
the,
as I talk, I'm going
Hollow
to mute you to block background noise, but I will unmute you when I'm done.
Okay, thanks.
So, anyway, when you're talking about like a story like And Then There Were None, that is they call that a plot-based novel because the characters are almost like dolls, right? Like they have traits, and then you set them up and you knock down the domino and you watch those traits bounce off. But the real appeal of a story like And Then There Were None, which, by the way, is a great book that I highly recommend if you have not read it. But the real appeal of a story like And Then There Were None is the puzzle. It's reading the story, teasing out all of the clues, and figuring out who is committing the murders in the story, which is what the book is about, right? And it is called Agatha Christie's masterpiece by a lot of people, and I would agree with that. I think it is. This is the appeal of most Agatha Christie stories. Not all of them. She was also a romance writer, which people don't realize because she did it under a pseudonym. But most Agatha Christie stories were what we now call, coming from G.K. Chesterton, of all people, fair play mysteries, meaning that the reader could theoretically solve the mystery if they put the clues together. So the appeal of an Agatha Christie is to follow the clues to solve the murder or solve the crime, right? And in that case, you could say, well, that's a plot-based story. And then a character-based story would be like, you follow Joe in his coming-of-age novel as he grows up as a middle schooler. Or and for an actual real-world example that none of you have heard of, but I have, because this is like a local author made good, named Jordan Sonnenblick. He wrote a book called Notes from the Midnight Driver that was about a guy in high school who got drunk and crashed his car into a bunch of lawn gnomes and was assigned to do community service, and it was about his character development. And you could say, well, that's a character-based novel, because like the appeal of the story is seeing how this character interacts with other characters and grows and changes. It's not figuring out the plot and figuring out what happened. But here's where I think this is not very helpful as a distinction. There is a misnomer that, like, if you write a plot-based novel, I think that some writers have it in their heads that you need to come up with a really clever plot first. But in fact, all plot-based novels are plot-based novels because they are what the characters would do, right? Like, when plot happens, they should only happen because your characters, as you have written them, as you have described them, as they have been consistently characterized, will do these things consistently, right? They will be the ones who would make these sorts of decisions. If you are If you find yourself needing to make your characters act in ways that don't make sense to fit your plot, it's not justified because, well, I have a plot-based novel. You need to change something fundamental about your story. Now, this is one of the reasons I like the way that the Snowflake outline is structured, because in the Snowflake outline, after you do your full page outline, it has you shift gears and start writing your characters in more detail. This allows there to be a really good symbiotic relationship where you have an idea of what you're writing, but if it starts not to make sense with your characters, you're not so late into outlining that you're wed to this story. You could change things around based on how your characters are characterized in your head and on paper, and whether or not what they're doing actually makes sense with how you've set them up and now how you imagine them. Do you have any thoughts on this, David, April?
Well, so usually I follow the approach of what does the character want or what's opposing the character, and then build it from there. So I build it from a conflict basis. If you're building from a character basis, you're also building from kind of their goals, but you're taking kind of a deeper look. You're taking a more holistic look, perhaps. So it's less going to be about the overall driving plot, which could be like one thing, sort of like a roller coaster or a train ride. You're now going to a series of paths because you're resolving several different things and how they interplay. And in something where you get that complicated, you still want to have some way of organizing it all. Otherwise, you can just get lost very easily. Like I've seen a lot of, read a fair number of things where they seem to just lose the track of the plot. So if you're going to do character-based, you still want some way to organize it, I think.
I wonder if you could look at it, because every story needs most stories need a public and a private conflict and goal. And maybe the plot-driven story focuses more on the public conflict or stake, personal and private stake, I guess. Or wait, no, public and private stake. I don't know, whatever kind of like conflict going on. Usually works well to have some sort of inner or personal conflict plus whatever like larger driving conflict. And so possibly the plot driven, do you think maybe more plot driven ones focus more on the like public stake and more like character driven ones focus more on the like private stake?
Yeah,
Does
I
that make
think
sense?
so. Yes, it does. Like Jaji's two strings theory is kind of it's kind of the centerpiece of her entire writing program. This idea that if everything has two strings, which strings are her term for like two different aspects of something, and it creates an illusion of depth. And that sounds like a cynical way of putting it, because in some cases it's not really an illusion. It's real depth to an extent, but it's a way of making it seem like, wow, you have these really deep and interesting characters and plots and themes, when in reality, you just have two, and they seem to be in tension with each other. Not necessarily conflict, not necessarily directly opposed, but intention.
Two different ideas, and it doesn't like each like they can change in different scenes, and a lot of times when it comes to, like overall plot, like they can maybe shift a little bit, or you have more than two, but it's two ideas that like I think her one example is like first idea is clowns going on like they have to cross this desert. The second idea is there's a clown eating worm in the desert. Two ideas that can play off of each other and cause conflict, or it's hard for me to really explain it well. But yeah, it doesn't always have to be, polar opposite.
Right.
But like if you've got a scene where it's like, some sort of character developments happening as well as some other like plot driving things happening. Just two things going. Like if you just have characters sitting, having tea and discussing like the past events, that gets boring. But if they're trying to discuss it during like a car chase, that's more interesting.
Yeah, so this is something that I actually tried to use in my most recent Pinkerton's Ghost story. So, in my most recent Pinkerton's Ghost story, you're all getting a teaser of this because I have it planned. So I'm not going to reveal the ending. You still get all the fun parts, but my main character, Sean, is having a conversation with his girlfriend at a fancy restaurant, and it's about their relationship. Now, this is a yawn type thing, right? Like, who cares? But the fun part is the second string, which is they're doing this while increasingly weird things are happening in the restaurant that slowly raise, in theory, if I do it right, the awareness of the reader, but not necessarily my main character, because he is distracted with what to him is a very important conversation about where their relationship might be going or if it's going anywhere. Something that would be boring to the outside world, but it's not boring to Sean. But it all becomes much more interesting because now you're watching this conversation with tension in the background. This is, again, the theory. Will it be successful? We will see.
I think that's a good example of the string because it's like they don't have to be both super like pressing things. Like, it kind of starts with them mostly with that conversation, but through the scene, you've got this other string slowly building. So I think that's a good example of it.
And this is a short story version of it. The thing about Jaji's two strings theory is that she kind of has it run through like everything, plot, character. Like if you add that second string, it fixes, it sort of fixes stories in a way. Like
it's really about contrast. Like
yeah,
it's like kind of boils down to contrast, especially with characters.
So, David, have you heard anything about like what we're talking about before? Is this an idea that's familiar to you at all?
What, running both a plot-based and a character-based thing?
Not exactly. Like when we're referring to two strings, we're referring to if you have a story, you should have multiple things going on at any one time. So
like you could have a almost just kind of character driven thing where they're having like a character's having a conversation with someone, but in their head thinking the complete opposite of like what they're saying. Like,
sure.
Or kind of some, two kind of ideas running alongside each other. It doesn't always have to be like both super present, like in Anthony's example, but it's kind of it's hard to pin down and really explain sometimes, but basically two ideas or two contrasting or conflicting things kind of happening somewhat alongside each other. And you can have more than one string. They could you don't have to have the exact same string running through the entire plot the same way. Like it could kind of it develops and changes as it moves through, but it kind of follows whatever's kind of happens.
Have two goals that the character's trying to pursue.
And that's a great.
They interfere.
That is like, especially if it's conflicting, right? Like someone that really wants to travel, but also really wants to have a nice garden.
Right.
That's a great way to create contrast within the character. And it's like, you don't always have like polar opposites don't always work for like contrast, making some depth and contrast to the character, but having two kind of somewhat conflicting or two different things, like the character in the story I'm working on right now, she has kind of wishes she could just kind of disappear and live in the woods forever, but also gets really lonely and wants to find like a sense of community that she's never had.
Yeah, like I'm going to give an example.
Moments too.
Oh, go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
Where you are very focused on one thing, so you can have even multipolar, multivariant types of things where there's all these different things pulling or a bunch of things going on, and then you can contrast that with a full page or two of it's just this moment. Like time slows down, all the focus is on this. It could be good, it could be bad, it could be transcendent, it could be peaceful, it could be action, like whichever it happens to be. But you want to have those moments where everything is about that particular thing or object or person that's happening. And then you can go back into the normal flow, and that change will catch people's attention.
Yeah, I'm going to give what I think is a great example of this. And the reason it's going to be very random to you guys, it's not to me because I just watched a video on this show, but it's a particular show. So, Cowboy Bebop. So, first off, have either of you watched it?
Nope.
April, have you seen Bebop by any chance?
Yeah, I had to get to my mute button. I think we've like halfway through it.
So
Seen
this
most
is
of
the
it.
original anime, right? Not the terrible
Yeah.
Netflix show.
Yeah, that thing doesn't exist now. The anime.
Yeah. So Cowboy Bebop. It's a shame you have David. I would highly recommend it because I actually think you would love it. Like it is right up from what I understand of your taste. It would be right up your alley. It is this really cool noir space western-ish thing. It's honestly, it calls itself a new genre unto itself. I think that the best way to put it would be space jazz improvisations on a theme with each episode, but whatever. This isn't an advertisement for Cowboy Bebop. It's about a specific thing in there. The characters in Cowboy Bebop are really, really great at like presenting this sort of contrast, this sort of two strings contrast. So one great example, one of the main characters, Jet. Jet loves order. He loves keeping things tidy and in order and in place. He loves gardening. He is a very he grows his bonsai plants on his spaceship, the Bebop, and he is at peace and he is at zen. Jet is also a bounty hunter who lives with his best friend, and they are friends, even though they sometimes display it in a rather hostile way. He lives and works with his best friend Spike, who is an extremely chaotic person who is always causing chaos on his ship. So you have this contrast in the character. Jet is a character who likes order and like things to be tidy and in their place and predictable. He likes gardening, but he also likes his friend Spike, and he is good at violence, and he is good at hunting people down, and that is how he needs to earn his paycheck, and that's how he gets his order. That's the two strings of Jet, the contrasts of the character. Even more, I think, obviously, you have a character like Faye Valentine, where she is presented when you first meet her as a super cool badass femme fatale, when in fact she is not a badass femme fatale at all. That is almost the opposite of who the character is. She is actually a complete poser. She needs to act this way because she does not have any skills at all. Her sex appeal is the one thing that can sometimes help her out of sticky situations, because otherwise she is incompetent. And she has been forced into this scenario. She would much rather be living a normal life like a normal person. But this is what she has been kind of reduced to. Only she doesn't want to admit that. So she covers it up with this veneer of being this super sexy, super cool, badass bounty hunter. It's pretty fascinating. Cowboy Bebop is excellent at creating these really layered characters where you have these two contrasting traits to them that make it like, they want order, but they're good at bounty hunting. And that's chaotic. Spike, for example, is a person who he mentions that there are three things he hates. He hates dogs, he hates women, and he hates women with attitude, and he hates kids. And at one point in the show, all three of them end up on his ship.
Of course.
And he says this, but Spike, I guess it's technically Jet's ship, but Spike has seniority. He could kick them off. He doesn't, because Spike has ultimately, even though he's not necessarily a good person, quote unquote, he does have, he has his morals. He's not just going to kick them off, right? Like, he's not going to do that because that would be cruel. So, that's what you get with Cowboy Bebop. These characters who have conflicts that contrast with each other. Spike doesn't like any of those things, but he also doesn't like to be needlessly cruel to people, and kicking them off his ship would be needlessly cruel. That's where you get Jet wants order, but he also needs to eat, and he's good at bounty hunting. Faye wants to live a normal life, but that's been robbed from her So she needs to leverage her sex appeal to survive. And there you get the conflicts of the characters on Bebop. It's a really great example of what we're talking about. So, in terms of plotting a full-length novel, I do think that's a really, really good way to create really interesting characters. Now, in the Orpheus novel that I am currently working on, I've been thinking about how to do this, which could be kind of difficult. Oh no, April left for a moment. I hope April comes back. I don't know if she will. Because we only have like 10 more minutes before I'm going to cut the recording, but
Right. It's
I have
that time. Yeah.
Anyway, in my Orpheus novel, the thing about Orpheus is that I have an idea for my ending and I know exactly where I'm going with it. So Orpheus's goal is pretty simple. But the problem is that early on, Orpheus doesn't really have a goal. He kind of drifts along with life, and that is the point. The idea is that he meets Eurydice, and Eurydice kind of helps him to grow a backbone. Like he finds something in someone that he wants to fight for. April's back.
Hello.
Hello. I'm about to finish my thought, and then I'll let other people speak again, because I've been dominating for a little bit now. Don't worry, this won't be that long. So, with Orpheus, I think what I wanted, one really good way to add like a second string, as Jaji would call it, to your character, is romance. Romance is a great second string. The Empire Strikes Back is a brilliant example of this. The Han and Leia story adds so much to that movie, and technically it is entirely unnecessary. You could take it out from the movie, and the plot would remain the same. Everything would happen in exactly the same way if Leia and Han just happened to be working together.
Well,
right?
One of the things that makes Empire kind of brilliant is you have first you've kind of amazingly they haven't raised the stakes quite as much. So like this isn't the Death Star, planet's not going to get blown up, but the rebellion is on the back foot. You have these very personal plots that are also involved. You have the Han and Leia romance. You have Luke is concerned about now that he's found his dad. Okay, you have all of this character growth, all of this much more personal stuff. They stop just being stock characters. You know, the scruffy rogue, the idealistic boy becoming a man, the venerable teacher. Like they just go beyond that. And, you know, even Leia, who was like the princess, but she was also like the scrappy gun mall, like simultaneously, everyone gets more depth. Everyone gets more development. They have personal stakes as well as it's all just the Empire versus the Rebellion. And it's going really badly for them there. They're having one disaster after another. And so it creates a lot of drama. In a lot of ways, it's a much more mature movie than Episode 4.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Mostly, what I'm getting at here, though, is that the addition of the second string of the romance is a great example of what we're talking about when we talk about adding that, you know, that secondary conflict, because it's not something that's necessary to the story. It's not something that would make or break the story if it were not there or if it is there, but it is something that adds so much to the story. Literally, my favorite line in all of Star Wars is not Luke, I am your father, or actually it's just no, I am your father, but whatever.
Mhm.
It's Han Solo saying when Leia says I love you and Han responds I know, and
Right.
Hans Zimmer's score goes in the background. That moment gets me every time. It's so perfectly in character.
Yes, as opposed to the usual like me too, or you know, all of the other ways that you would expect. It is a very Han response to the whole thing.
Right. It's a very Han response, and it's also there's just something about it that's like so pure. Like you almost can't imagine it being after he says it, you can't imagine it any other way than just that.
Right?
Oh no, April's gone again. Let's see if she shows up before the end of the stream, then I'll just let her speak so that I don't dominate. Hey.
Yes. Then you had the prequel movies romance. the less of which is said.
April, you can speak. I want to give you an opportunity to say something before.
Yeah, because I'm going to be trying to lay the boy down soon, so I won't be able to speak as much then. So I have some thoughts on like Top Gun as far as plotting goes. So we watched the original Top Gun days ago, and then just got back this evening from watching the new one, which was really good, by the way. And it was interesting because I noticed with the original Top Gun and the movie Stripes, which is another kind of like ex-military movie from like the 80s, I think, where the plot is almost like just focused on the characters in the schooling, and then there's like this crazy mission thrown in at the end. Whereas the like, my sister-in-law watched it, was like, I was kind of bored with it. I enjoyed the old, the original one a lot. Enjoyed both of them a lot, really. First one was definitely goofier, and there's some parts that I was just like cracking up at. I like pointed and laughed at the love scene in the first one, and trying not to laugh at the like montage, like romantic bit in the second one, but. That's probably being picked up by my microphone. Anyway, but just plotting wise, it was interesting the difference and realizing the two kind of 80s movies kind of followed this like, oh, they're doing this schooling and whatever kind of like shenanigans and different stuff happening between the characters during the schooling, and then there's this crazy mission thrown in at the very end of the movie that wraps it up. And then the new Top Gun has much more of the like, they have a much higher stake like ticking kind of time bomb throughout the whole movie that they're all working towards, and has a lot more kind of tension and action on the overall because they have that mission they're trying to lead up to, versus them just kind of in the schoolhouse and then, there's a mission at the end.
I started to speak, but I was muted. That's interesting. So you would say that Top Gun Maverick was the superior film?
So Top Gun Maverick, I think like took it more seriously. Like Top Gun, the original, like it wasn't trying to be more than what it was, which was a fun 80s movie, I think. Top Gun Maverick kind of like took, there's a lot of really nice kind of like homage or throwbacks. Like the opening scene in both, like in the original one was a little montage of the jets taking off and landing, and they did, kind of a retake of that, which was kind of fun. But yeah, they kind of took a lot from the first one and kind of like deepened it and wrapped it up in a like kind of more serious or tighter like plot, and like there's a lot of like there's a great example of there's a very big high stake mission that they're going to be going on. And then there's a very intense interpersonal relationship struggle that's going on. And so it took it off a little more seriously, but like in a good way. There's a lot of like heart, I think, that was put into this movie to make it really good, like, just storytelling wise and production wise. And so I think they wanted to kind of take like a lot of the good stuff from the first film and kind of like, wrap it up all together, even like better. So let's see, I guess storytelling wise, like if you just looked at them objectively of like what the plot and stuff was, I guess you could say the the Maverick is superior by probably most people's taste nowadays, because they expect a little more action and intensity, whereas it seems like the 80s films that I've seen, like Stripes and the original Top Gun, have a more leisurely kind of pace. The pacing was a little odd at times because it's like technically a couple weeks, but sometimes felt like a couple days with the schooling, and like how different relationships progressed. But I guess it's kind of more what they were trying to do with the movie, or what was kind of expected from the movies at the time. I enjoyed them both. So I guess, I don't know, I'm not going to put a definite like, oh, this one was much better. I think it did pacing and stuff better, so you could maybe say it's the more superior film, but I don't think the previous film was trying to be like anything more than it was, if that makes sense.
No, that does make perfect sense. I appreciate that. I'm just curious. We are now at the end of our live stream. We are about almost exactly 1 hour in. So, any closing thoughts, David? First.
Closing thoughts. I would recommend Strongest. Have your ending ready ahead of time. Have your beginning really sound, and then build the arc in between. Other things can fall in place after that, but you want those down solid.
April, any closing thoughts?
I would say you don't have to know what your ending is ahead of time, but once you do have it all together, I think Judge has mentioned the biggest mistake she sees in like new writers is that they don't put things early enough. So once you have your ending figured out, take something from the end and start like weaving it in at the beginning, so that there's, it makes sense when you get there, and it like brings it a little more like full circle, or like keeps that, take that string that wraps up at the end and start weaving it in at the beginning. I think is like a pretty solid tip. Any other closing thoughts? I don't know. Yeah, find what works for you. Don't be afraid of like waiting for the perfect idea or the perfect plot or the perfect like character. Poke at your ideas enough and like poke at it, do some research, get some more ideas, keep poking, keep researching different aspects that might help bring out more ideas. And just learn, don't be afraid to learn how to like manipulate and mold your ideas into a coherent story and figure out what your best process for doing that is. Like my husband is much more of a pantser, and that works for him. I like having a kind of at least roadmap or general kind of point, depending on the story. Kind of depends on how deep I get. I know there's been points in some stories where I'm like, okay, I've gotten this far. I need to actually start writing it to figure out the rest of the details.
Excellent. Thank you. For my final thought, I'm just going to say I do recommend that if you're having trouble outlining your story, you do try the Snowflake outline method. I found it to be extremely helpful. It provides a lot of clarity and a lot of structure, and it's very flexible. You don't need, it's not wed to having specific plot beats at specific times or things like that, like a lot of these, structures are. It's just a way of putting your idea out there in more and more detail so that you know what you're writing when you get to it. And that's why I really am a fan of it, generally speaking. And that is going to be all for today. David, April, thank you for coming at such short notice. This is going to hopefully, if I can figure out how to do it, get set up on YouTube. If it is not set up on YouTube, then at least we had a fun discussion.
Sure enough.
So, everyone, thank you for listening after the fact. As for next live stream, I think we have a plan, but I don't remember what it is. That's going to be Ben's job. He better be here next week because this was a pain. Have a good day, everybody.
Take care.